Welcome to the podcast of Rogue Valley Christian Church, located in Medford, Oregon. We strive to be a people who gather together to connect the unconnected to Jesus, grow together in full devotion to God, and serve the world with Him.
Good morning. It's good to see you all. If you can, grab a Bible and you can turn to the book of Colossians, chapter 2. You can find verse 16. As you're doing that, again, we are making our way through the letter that Paul wrote to the church at Colossae some 2,000 years ago. Very applicable to our day and age, and I think you'll see a little bit of that today. But as we make our way through the passage that we're going to look at today, let me give you a couple of spoiler alerts. Number one, Paul is we will see this morning as we make our way from verses 16 of chapter 2 through 23, Paul's going to warn the Colossian Christians about a couple of things. And I want to encourage you that I think within those warnings we're going to see some things that will be super helpful for us as we are determining to live abundantly, right? I'll explain more of that later. But as we get into it, I also want to encourage us and challenge us not to see the scriptures so self-centeredly today. Paul's going to warn them. He's going to say, hey, don't let anybody pass judgment on you. Be careful and hold out, or why do you do this? That these people are putting pressure upon you for. Remember, the Colossians were doing well in their Christianity, but probably and most likely under a bunch of pressure. Today we see what those pressures are. And as we see them, Paul's going to warn against buying into those pressures or giving into those pressures. And I got to encourage us, on one level, as we hear that, it's going to be very me-focused, okay, I do this and I don't do that, which is ironic because it's not doing a bunch of things that were do this and don't do that rules and regulations. And it's going to be easy for us to look at it and go, oh, okay, this is all about me. But I want to encourage us as we think about, especially as a church, as we think about the Scriptures, and as we think about interacting with the Scriptures and reading the Scriptures, it is my opinion that I hold very highly that first and foremost, any passage that we see in the Scriptures is not necessarily about me, but first and foremost, it's about what it's revealing about God. And even as God is saying, do this and don't do that and be careful about these things, He's revealing some things about Himself. I suggest to you today, if you think about it, and we look at passages, and I know that you guys have been doing this in your small groups, but as we look at it, I want to challenge you. Look and see these warnings as not just what we do or what we don't do or what we have to be careful about or what we're not careful about. See them as they reveal who God is. I suggest He's going to reveal Himself today as a God who cares about His people. He cares so much so that even through the miraculous process of His Spirit and His guide in the Apostle Paul working miraculously and even supernaturally together, He cares in such a way for His people both then and now that He would see to it that something would be written down that we could be careful about or that we could be warned about. And I want to encourage us, see the warnings as the very revelation of who God is. He's a God who cares. He's a God who is, I suggest, jealous, and very much so. See, the pressures that they were struggling with were pressures that were to get them to do this or don't do that in order to find themselves in a position that would be more holy, more spiritual, more acceptable to God. And yet God's warning against that. Why? Because He's a jealous God, and He recognizes that His grace and His love is more than enough, and He won't share that with anyone, nor will He allow for it to be watered down. In a sense, we could also see God as a protective God. He's not only protective of His grace, but also His people. He doesn't want them then or us now to get confused or tripped up by man-made rules and regulations that were meant to be a trip on people, to confuse them into thinking that if they don't touch or don't handle or observe this day or bow down to this created being, that somehow in doing those things or not doing those things, they'll find themselves more acceptable to God. And what we have to recognize is this: God is a God of love, right? Because these warnings actually remind us that He loved the world so much that He would send His Son, that whoever would believe in Him wouldn't perish but have everlasting life. For His Son came in the world not to condemn the world, but to save the world through Him, right? They remind us of the depth of God's love and His grace that He will not allow to be watered down. You see, the gospel for us is great news, not just good news, but great news, because it's a reminder and a revelation of the depth of God's love, so much so that in His Son, He accomplished everything that was required for you and I to stand before God in a holy way, to stand before God as acceptable, to stand before God as right in His sight or righteous. Like, that's all accomplished in Jesus, His life, His death, His resurrection. Like, He's accomplished it all. And God is jealous about that, and God is protective of that, and God is loving in that. He cares for you and He cares for them in such a way that He would make sure that we wouldn't get tripped up by any kind of trip that would have us to believe that we can, by doing something or not doing something, add to the grace of God and find ourselves to be in a more favorable position than somebody else. And God, through Paul, is saying that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's not the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to remember, even through these passages, that we have been saved by grace. Remember what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. He says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing, but it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast." In other words, God's saying it's by grace through faith that I've been saved, and we didn't do anything to deserve it. That's why it's called grace. In other words, He's done everything, and now we just live in response to that grace. Not as a requirement for, right? And that's where we get tripped up, isn't it? Rules, regulations, as it relates to today, legalisms and mysticisms and asceticisms, I'll unpack those words for you. But all of those things try to confuse us into thinking that we actually bring some sort of work to the cross that somehow helps make us more acceptable to God. And I got good news for you. That's not the gospel. The gospel says that Jesus has brought everything to the cross, and He has taken upon Himself all that we were not, all of our sin, so that we would be, according to His blood, forgiven and given life and life abundant. Here's how this is going to play out. It'll play out in such a way that we'll see it, and hopefully we'll be encouraged to actually not... Well, the hope is that, listen, I'm reminded of like 3 or 4 conversations I had during the Connections time. Right? The hope is that we wouldn't get so stressed out and worried about somebody else's rules and regulations that they put on us that we forget to live and keep Jesus as our, be thou my vision. Like, that song is not just old school and artsy and cool that way, and it is. That song is profound in that we're proclaiming before God that you are all that I'm going to keep my eyes on. And the problem with these isms that Paul is going to say to be careful about is they actually cause us to take our eyes off of Him and put them on ourselves. And I don't know about you, but for me, that's never actually gone all that great. I'm usually always, on the one hand, super bummed out because I recognize as I look myself in the mirror that I can't do all that I think I'm supposed to do for salvation and forgiveness and spirituality, and I look in the mirror and I think, you're just a mess. Do you guys have that struggle? Or on the other hand, you catch me at a good week, and I walk a little bit more like this. All cocky and arrogant and prideful. This, just so you know, is my pride power stance. Don't practice it at home. It's not what it's all cut out to be. You're not going to feel as cool as I look. Right? So on the other hand, I end up over here where I'm like, look at me and what I've done. I am super spiritual, which is to say, I recognize I'm not as spiritual as some who have gone before me, but if I accomplish all that I think I should on my own, and I keep my eyes on me, guess what? Super spiritual means I'm better than you are. Ooh, you guys didn't like that, did you? Was there a part of you that wanted to stand up and go, oh yeah, I have my own evidence, right? And this is the problem with what Paul is going to warn against. Is these things cause us to take our eyes off of him and him as our vision, and it puts us on each other and ourselves, and then we get into comparisons, and then we get into judgments, and then we get into like he said, she said, and then we get into gossip, and then we get into a church divided, which by the way he takes very seriously. Did you know that God protects his church and he takes the unity thereof very seriously, so much so that he tells Timothy and Titus, if you find somebody being divisive in the church, warn them once and then send them away. Are you with me? Like that's old school. That don't fly today, right? What if we looked at you and said, you need to stop gossiping, you're dividing the body of Christ, and you go, no I don't, and then you do it again, and we go, okay, scripturally, which we say that we're all about, the Bible says you warn you once, now it's time for you to leave. Then you would go on Twitter? It's next upcoming thing. There would be plenty of, there would be plenty of platforms that would allow you to complain about me and the church and blah, 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 blah. And there'd be plenty of people who go, you poor thing. And there'd be no way for us to go, yeah, but you were actually slandering and gossiping people. I don't care, it's my truth. Ugh. Our world is so screwed up. However, listen, there's hope in it. Look at what Paul says. Let's pick it up. Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Paul's going to warn us against something. He warns us against, I suggest to you, what we could call legalism. He says this, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. Just so you know, most scholars believe that the pressure that was being put on the Colossians was this hybrid combination of Jewish mysticism and kind of a like an infant like stage level of Gnosticism. That clarifies it for us all, doesn't it? You guys know so much more now, right? But in a sense, like we can get some thoughts here. He says, "Let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food or drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath." In a sense, here's what Paul's saying. He's saying, "Don't let anybody tell you that maintaining spiritual diets or observing special days will make you more holy to God." That's what legalism's all about. Just so you know, it's not just rules and regulations. Do you see what I mean? I mean, just so you know, we have some guidelines and rules and regulations about helping out with kids and about keeping kids safe. Are you with me? And we wouldn't say that's legalism. We'd say that's wisdom. Amen? But legalism says this. See, we don't say that if you do this and if you don't do that, not only are our kids safe, but you'll be more spiritual and more acceptable to God. That would be legalism, and that's what legalism does. It kind of tricks us into thinking that if we keep this or if we keep that regulation or this rule, or in this case, if we don't eat those foods but we eat these ones on this specific day, and if we set aside this one day or this number of days as more holy than the other, and I observe those days, then that's going to make me more acceptable to God. Now the problem with that is this. It takes away from the grace of God in Christ. Listen to what Paul says. He says in verse 17, "These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to God." See, while these things may look godly, they are not actually from God. Look at the language that he used. They're a shadow. Like it appears to be like what God would look like, but if you look closer, it's not actually God himself. He says they're not actually connected to Christ. The substance of is him. It's him. So here's the interesting thing. Not only are these things dangerous in that we start paying more attention to shadows than we do our Savior, but when we do that, we become distracted. Like Jesus is no longer our vision. I was thinking about this earlier in the week, and I was thinking, well, what's a good example for us? Like days and diets, and I won't get into diets, because some would say, well, this, that, or the other. We don't have to get into that. It's not one of the big type issues. In our spiritual culture, in our spiritual, sense, there's not a whole lot being thrown around about this diet or don't eat that or whatever. Are you kidding me? Have you seen our Connections Time food bank? There's 12 items on that thing that we probably shouldn't eat. Just physically speaking, but we do, right? I had 3 donut holes, a half a donut, some sweet bread, and then another half a donut. Which means this: things are about to get real crazy, or I'm going to crash. We shall see. But the one example that I came up with that we do kind of have to mess around with, not just with what people out there, but it's like, have you ever thought about Sunday morning? Sunday morning's a day, isn't it? Sunday morning's, it's church day. I don't know why this reminds me of church, but it's church day. Sunday morning's church day. I don't know about you, but it's easy to get church day mixed up. It's easy to make church day, Sunday, it's easy to make that an act of work instead of what it's supposed to be, which is an act of worship. Are you with me? And it's easy when we make it an act of work that to kind of buy into this thought that says, well, if you look at my track record for the last year, I have perfect attendance. I've gone to church every single Sunday, 52 of them, for the last year. And just so you know, I also am usually down here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday as well. Clearly, I'm better than you. While you come once a day, I come almost every. Right? You see what happens? That's what happens when Sunday becomes an act of work instead of an act of worship. It allows us to be prideful about what we've accomplished. But on the other hand, I know people that it makes them feel guilty for what they didn't do. I remember having a conversation with somebody one time, and they're like, oh yeah, Pastor, it's just my life, just so you know. If you see me at Fred Meyer, you can interact with me like I'm Pastor Darrin, but will you just please talk to me like I'm normal dude Darrin? Is that okay? In other words, what I'm saying is this: you do not have to apologize to me about missing church the Sunday before. Number one, yeah, that's fine. That's the truth, Dick. Number one, I probably didn't notice. I'm worried about me. Number two, you're judging yourself, not me. Number 3, if I could, I would. Are you with me? No, I'm being serious. According to my work agreement, and I embrace it and I love it and I have no problems with it, Lon, Paul, and any other leadership dude in the building or watching online, I love it. I feel blessed to be able to call this not only my church, but my job and my people and I just love it. But there are certain Sundays I'd rather stay home and watch football. There are certain Sundays that I'd rather not face at all. Right? And I'm not the only one. You guys struggle with it. But the difference is you don't have somebody saying you only get 3. So, and that's totally fair. It's totally fair. I love it. Right? But if you see me in Fred Meyer on a Tuesday and you didn't go to church on Sunday, I'm interested in you being okay. I'm not interested in your religiosity. And so I have people say, I'm so sorry I wasn't at church on Sunday. And I'm like, well, why? What happened? What, you okay? Yeah, we just we took our family and we went up into the snow and we had a great time. And I was like, that sounds like a fabulous time. Did you pray? Did you just love God while you were doing it? Well, we did eat some peanut butter crackers, and I didn't pray out loud, but I was thankful that I had them. I said, sounds churchy to me. But then people get confused about that. Wait, are you saying that it's okay not to go to church? I'm saying this: if we have to ask that question, maybe we shouldn't go, because it's supposed to be an act of worship. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you shouldn't go. I'm just saying the reason we should go is maybe about all that he's done and not what we're trying to earn. your place and chair on a Sunday morning does not make you more lovable to God. Because in Jesus, he couldn't love you anymore. He loves you more. He loves you with all the love that he has, whether you're filling that chair or not. Now, I suggest to you, once we realize that he loves us this much, I almost fell. That when we recognize he loves us this much, then any day I want to be in that chair telling him thank you. Does that make sense? Ladies and gentlemen, Paul says, let no one pass judgment on you. Don't let anybody tell you that you're not as acceptable to God because you don't keep a certain diet or recognize holy days. Jesus would say through Paul later, he would say, instead, because of everything that Jesus has done for us, we can present ourselves, according to Romans chapter 12, verse 1, as living sacrifices. And this is our very act of worship, saying, God, you've made me alive. Here I am. I'm all yours, all in, every day, all day. You're the best. It's not very churchy language, is it? But all of our hearts just went, ooh, I like that. And I want to encourage you to fill out a Connect card. No, I'm kidding. Don't do that, he says. He goes on in verse 18, and he goes, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism or worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from which the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with the growth that is from God. Paul, in verses 18 and 19, he warns against what we could call like this mysticism, this like worship of angels. This is what he says. Don't let anybody tell you that you don't belong because you don't bow down to created beings in order to find more acceptance or find more favor with God. Again, just so you know, it's super weird when you study some of this technical stuff out, but when you study it out, Paul combines asceticism, which is not doing certain things physically. It's like being willing to suffer physically by foregoing certain things. He combines that with the worship of angels. Just so you know, here's the interesting thing. These guys, in their messed up ideas about spirituality, this was actually kind of a false humility thing. Like, in other words, what Paul's saying is, don't let anybody tell you you don't belong because you're not being humble enough, right? Because here's what he's saying. When he says asceticism and worship of angels, in this Jewish mystical system that was probably pressuring them, they actually believed that any created thing was evil. All matter was evil. Therefore, Jesus couldn't be God because he was physical in the flesh. And so he was this less emanation of God. But they also viewed that way in terms of angelic beings. And so they would say, follow me on this. If it's confusing, email me later. But they would say this, like, we're so humble that we deny ourselves certain pleasures, and we wouldn't even think that we could actually worship God because he's so great. We're so humble that we won't give our worship to God because how could we ever do that? Instead, we'll give it to a lesser being to somehow show God how humble we are. Now, on the one hand, do you guys follow the logic, right? It seems to make sense. But on the other hand, it doesn't make sense at all. Because it's not the gospel. It's not what Jesus has communicated. It's not what God has given us. God has given us the ability to no longer be afraid, but to actually present ourselves in worship to God Almighty. And he's saying, don't let anybody tell you that you don't belong because you're somehow supporting some sort of false humility thing. Look at what he says. He says, these things, they're detailed visions puffed up by reason or without reason by their sensuous mind. A sensuous mind, that word means, it means like I take great pleasure in. It means like I get something great out of it. So the rule or the idea even of itself is not about giving glory to God. It's about getting pleasure for themselves. Like somehow the false teachers were seeing pleasure in telling God's people not to do this and to do this, or this is the way you find spirituality. And then they would have to connect it to them, and they would feed on that and be going, ironically, they were saying they were humble, but all the while they're like, my mind made this up, and you're following it, and it feels really good. You guys ever manipulated somebody? Like everybody's like, ooh, I don't know, this is church and I'm not sure how to answer that question. But the truth of the matter is, most of us at one time or another have probably manipulated somebody. And before we recognize how terrible that was, when we accomplished it, there probably was a sense of like, oh yeah, I'm a mover of people's wills. Right? And if you don't think like that, then I'm sorry, I have before, and it's a terrible place to be. It's so scary. That's the sensuous mind. It just takes great pleasure in confusing people into doing what you tell them to do or what not to do. He goes on and he further says, it's puffed up without reason by a sensuous mind. In other words, it just doesn't make sense. And, more importantly, it's not holding fast to the head, from which the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with the growth that is from God. He's saying it's not connected to Christ. Because it's not connected to Christ, though they're telling you it's going to make you more mature, it's not actually causing any growth because it's not what Jesus does. It's not the way Jesus works. I said this, I wrote this stuff down, and first service I bragged about it a little bit. Did you guys catch the irony? Like, this is a section about false humility, and I just told you I was bragging about something. I enjoy what God gets to do here. Listen, if Jesus hasn't authorized it, then maybe we shouldn't mandate it. So here's what I was bragging about. Man, I wrote that down on Thursday. Like on Thursday, I just so you guys know, it's not printed, it's written, my own handwriting, and I've highlighted it in apparently green because that's the color that I feel the most proud about. So as you can see, I'm proud of a lot here. And so I highlighted it in green. On Thursday, I wrote that down. And I wrote it down as a result of doing some study and whatnot, and I was like, oh man, I read it out loud. If Jesus hasn't authorized it, then maybe we shouldn't mandate it. And I was like, oh, that's good Bible. And so I was so excited. Josh was in his office next to mine. I put all the stuff down. I went in there and I go, you'll never guess what I just wrote down. And he's going, well, I'm quite sure you're going to tell me. And I was like, yes. So I was telling him and explaining this whole deal. And I was like, so therefore, like, it's not connected to the head and it doesn't cause us to grow. So why do we do this? I suggest that if Jesus hasn't authorized it, if he's not the authority and the one who brings it up and says this is the way it is, maybe we should stop mandating it. Isn't that awesome? And he looked at me and he was like, well, I mean, it's okay. Right? But then we talked it out some more, and his reaction was, no, that's actually really good. Just so you know, church history, not just this church, okay? I'm not just picking on Rogue Valley Christian Church. I'm just talking about observing the history of the church from the time of Christ. We're really, really good at mandating things that Jesus never authorized. Rules and regulations, what Bible to use, what pants to wear, what cross to bow down to, what person to pay homage to. You just name it. Throughout church history, I've got four or five books up in my office. I'll let you read them. I'll highlight the passages for you where we have done this. And I suggest to you what Paul is saying is this. Jesus never authorized that, so you don't have to do that. Because in doing that, bowing down to created beings or flagellating yourself to show your loyalty towards God, he says you don't have to do that. And when you do that, you're not actually keeping him as your vision. And you're actually drawing attention to yourself. So I was talking to Josh, and I was super excited about this. And I think I'm just more excitable than he is. No. Just like he's excitable. I just think mine shows more, right? But here's the interesting thing: we both got excited about this. Well, then it begs the question: what has Jesus authorized? Well, I'm glad you asked, so I'm going to tell you. John chapter 13, verses 34 through 35. He says this, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples if you have love one for another." What has Jesus authorized? Well, I'll tell you right now, he hasn't necessarily authorized the worship of angels and the self-flagellation to find yourself to be trying to prove your love to God. He didn't authorize that. Without a doubt, according to his very own word, he has authorized love. He has authorized love. And not junior high pizza love. He's authorized selfless, sacrificial, empathetic, compassionate, willing to help kind of love. He's actually authorized it. It's there in yellow, which is like, are you with me? He's authorized it. And I wonder how often we've missed it because we're so busy mandating and focusing and hypersensitizing about all these little rules and regulations that he's not mandated. In other words, we disguise impatience and non-compassion. We disguise even hatred as spiritual by saying, well, this is a good godly way to live. You don't do this and don't do that and don't do this and don't do that. And all the while we've missed the boat, and we're wondering why people who are smarter than we give them credit for, we wonder why they come in here and they never come back. Not in here, I'm just speaking proverbially. We wonder why they engage Christianity and Christians and then they have nothing to do with it. Why? Because I suggest to you, we cannot be, sometimes we're not the most loving people in the world. Right? Yeah? Do you know people have left because they've come to a church and they were asked to move out of that other person's seat? All in the name of Christianity. I 100%, but not necessarily here. We just recently read a book that talked about welcoming and being a loving church and so on and so forth. And there are people who don't go to church. One of the reasons they never come back is because there's a lack of love, and then there's all kinds of examples. Right? It's ironic. Jesus has authorized love. Why don't we mandate that? Why don't we insist on that? Why don't we insist on, yeah, you may have your favorite seat in the sanctuary. Cool. No worries. I'll tell you this. We're never going to put a name tag on there for you. We're just not going to do it. However, if you like to sit in a certain place, but you walk in on a Sunday morning and God forbid the heavens have adjusted and somebody else is in your seat, you know what love does? Love goes right up to him and says, "Can I get you a donut?" Right? Now, we might think love says this. "Hey, did you know there's donuts over there?" Because we know that donut is the universal language of manipulation, right? And they would say, "What, donuts? I'm going to go get one." And we would go, "Ha ha ha," I'm like, "Share. Great are you, God. Sing with me, how great." It's time. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I know that seems silly, but it's time for that kind of behavior to stop among God's people. And not just on that simplified level, but on a huge level. The calling card of the Christian is Christ's love in him and through him. And I suggest to you, it's about time we get ourselves more familiarized with what he has authorized, which is his love. Let it go through you. Yeah, but what about? Let God deal with the what-abouts. Amen? I'm yelling. He goes on in verse 20. He says this: "If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to its regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch." These all refer to things that are perishing as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed the spirit or the appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Paul warns against asceticism. In other words, he says this: "Don't let anyone tell you that their own man-made rules and regulations will give you more favor with God, because they won't. Their personal prohibitions won't help anyone in their struggle with sin. Does that make sense? I told a story during first service, and I don't know if I'll tell. It was a decent story, so I'll tell you, right? I wish I had a better one, but this is the one I got. When I was 18 years old, I became a Christian. And the guy who actually led me to the Lord, I ended up later on living with that guy and his wife. He just graciously let me in his house. And so it was very easy for him to disciple me and kind of mentor me in Christianity. And I remember on a Friday night, a friend of mine said, "Hey, there's this movie out. Let's go to the movie." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah. I like movies. Can I borrow some money?" And he said, "Yes." So it was going to be a great night, right? It was not a date, even though he was paying. So I got ready to go to the movie. And as I was walking out of the house, my buddy, the mentor, spiritual mentor, he goes, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to go to the movies. It's Friday night. I'm going out." He goes, "Oh, it's Friday night. I don't know if we do that." I said, "What?" "Well, what movie are you going to go see?" "Well, I'm going to go see this movie." I don't even remember what it was. I mean, we are talking about 1989. But I do know that it was rated R, which means rated wrong for Christians to go to. Right? Right? Are you with me? And some of you are like, "Oh no, I was at the movies last night." Where's he going with this? You're about to find out. So I tell my buddy, "I'm going to this movie." And he goes, "Wow, yeah, I mean, good Christians don't do that." And I was like, oh, okay. I guess we don't. See, I wasn't thinking about grace. I wasn't thinking about mercy. I wasn't thinking about the love of God or anything like that. I wasn't even thinking about the Spirit of God and His ability to guide and direct me. Later on, I would find out that even while going up to a movie that I didn't even have any questions about, while going to pay for it, I had this sense that maybe I shouldn't go. And so I didn't. And I have to believe that that's the Spirit of God, not legalism or asceticism. Are you with me? See the difference? So I didn't go to the movie. But I'll tell you what, this is what I told first service. I spent the rest of the night in my room, shut the door. Why? Because I was mad. I was mad at my mentor. Why? Because he wasn't letting me have any fun. And I started to realize, like, if I can't see that movie, I must be a really bad Christian. Because I see a lot of movies that are a lot worse, if he only knew. So then, what happened in my head, I began to resent him. And I began to, in my anger, get mad. And like, I actually found myself having hatred towards him. Here's the irony. There was this rule and regulation that was meant to protect me and guide me, but it was a man-made rule. And in the end, though I didn't see a rated R movie and sin that way, I may have sinned even worse, because I stewed in my bedroom for 2 hours hating the guy in the living room, hating what he was doing to me. I mean, not just like, "Oh, that's a bummer." I mean, devising ways to actually get back at him. Like, "Oh yeah, my rent's going to be late." You see what I mean? Right? What was I doing? Repaying evil for evil, right? That's what Paul says. Paul says, listen, don't get caught up into that. Ultimately, not only is it not from God, but it doesn't actually help you live a godly life. It doesn't actually help you in your battle with sin. See, here's the interesting thing. We usually settle for rules and regulations to try to make us better, when in reality we know what God's already revealed. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, he says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Paul says in Romans chapter 2 that we can actually count on Him, His Word, His people, and His Spirit to actually help us and actually lead us and guide us. We don't actually have to settle for somebody else's rules. Now, just so you know, the other side of the conversation, which we'll bring up in 2 weeks, does that mean that we can just go and do whatever we want? Well, kind of, but no, but kind of, if you will. What it means is that we are free to live an abundant life, and I believe an abundant life is all about listening, leaning into, and loving Jesus with everything we've got in every single moment, and just letting Him lead us through it. And I suggest to you, you'll probably find yourselves in situations you never thought you'd be in. You probably find yourselves doing things you never thought you'd do. You probably find yourselves not doing things you always thought you would do. But that's the Spirit's leading. And in that, we actually gain some sort of control over the battle that we have in the flesh with sin. Why? Because we're walking with God. And when we're walking with God, we're so much more aware of His grace and of His love and His care and His perfect will for our lives. And then it just makes sense to us. Even as He gives this stuff through His Word, His people, and His Spirit, we should pay attention. So Paul gives these profound warnings. But suggest, for the sake of time, and I'll make this really quick, I suggest it would be good for us to remember, it's not just imaginary, right? It would be good for us to remember what it looks like when we don't. You see, in John chapter 5, you don't have to turn there, I'll explain it for you. But in John chapter 5, we come across an episode in the ministry of Jesus. Now, the background of this episode is a religious culture that enforced all kinds of rules and regulations on people, that mandated things that Jesus or that God never authorized, that insisted on things and rules and regulations as a way to be more acceptable to God in a way that God never authorized. But that's what was going on within the context of this episode that we're about to hear about. So Jesus one day, it was a Sunday, it was a Sabbath day, so it was a Saturday in their culture. He goes to a town, he goes to Jerusalem, and while he's in Jerusalem, he finds his way to a pool in a town called Bethsaida or Bethesda. Either way is right. And around the pool of water, he finds numerous people that are in pain or paralyzed, that are hurting and without hope. He finds them sitting around the pool of water on the Sabbath day. And they're sitting there because the rules and regulations and man-made ideas had left them there. It was never God's intention that God's people would just leave people to superstition and tradition. And so Jesus finds a man. He can't move. He can't walk. He had been there for some time. He struggled with his issue for some 38 years. And everybody around him, religious Israel, had left him there paralyzed and in pain and without hope. And one day on the Sabbath day, John chapter 5, Jesus comes into that town and he makes his way to that pool of water and he asks the guy, "What are you doing?" And the guy, with hopelessness in his voice, says, "Nothing. I'm just sitting here." Why? Well, because when the water is stirred, you see, they had this superstitious belief that an angel would come down and touch the water. And when the water was stirred up, whoever got to the water first got hope and healed. Are you with me? And the guy is sitting there hopeless. And he's been there for a very long time. And Jesus says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm trying to get hope." "Well, is it working?" "No, it's not working. I'm sitting on a mat." "Why are you still sitting on your mat?" "Well, because nobody will help me to the water when it gets stirred up." And Jesus says, "Would you like to walk?" And I wonder if the first thought in the guy's mind was, duh. But that's not what the Bible says that he says. What it says that he says was yes. And Jesus says, "Rise, pick up your mat, and be well." Not well, but well. And he does. It's a Sabbath day, just so you know. Like that. Do you guys see that? Man-made interpretations when we manhandle God's spirituality and make it our own and twist it and turn it and put all kinds of rules and tricks on it that are meant to control people. Ultimately, we leave them on the sidelines in pain and maybe even paralyzed, not even able to move. Why? Because they might be afraid of making a mistake. How many people have you talked to, you invite them to church and say, "Hey, you should come to church. It's interesting," to say the least. And they say, "Oh, I couldn't go in there. The building will probably blow up on fire." What they're saying is this, right? They're not saying that they're so bad that God can't handle it. They don't even have the theology to understand what they're saying. Essentially what they're saying is, my life has left me paralyzed. In the religious culture that I've been around, has not given me confidence to think that I could actually be there. Like, there's all kinds of issues going on there. And you wonder, and you're like, no, building's not going to blow up. And they're going to look at you and go, how do you know? And you can say with confidence, because I go there. Yeah, but you're super Christian. I see what you do and what you don't do. And you'll be able to say, no, that's not the way it works. The building doesn't blow up because Jesus went to the cross and he died that I might have life. He forgave me. That's why it works. And people would say, well, wait a minute, are you serious? We say, yes. Like, people are paralyzed and in pain, and all we have to do is love them with what Jesus has authorized. His love that says, I'm willing to courageously go into your situation. When everybody else says it's supposed to be like this, I'll walk right into the middle of it and free you up. I'll walk right into the middle of it and allow you to walk and move. So the guy gets up and he goes into the temple, right? Where he goes in, and the Pharisees see him and they're like, wait a minute, how are you walking? Well, I put one foot in front of the other. It's been a while, but I think that's still how it works, right? And I said, okay, well, hold on. It's the Sabbath day. Yes. Why are you carrying your mat? Because they weren't supposed to. They had these rules. Carrying a mat was working on the Sabbath. Are you with me? Just leaves people stuck on a mat. And when Jesus says, listen, the thief has come to steal, kill, and destroy in John chapter 10, verse 10, the rest of it is, but I've come that you could have life and life abundant. I've come to allow you to pick up your mat and move wherever you want and not just have to exist on this 4 square feet of mat where everybody, where somebody might be willing to move it. So he says, why are you carrying your mat? It's the Sabbath. And he goes, listen, dude told me to pick it up. What dude? The same dude who fixed my legs. The same guy who did for me what you refused to do. That guy. He told me to carry my mat. Well, who was it? I don't know. But I'm going in here because I haven't been here for a while. Just so you know, in here was a place where they worship God in spirit and in truth and hope. I'm going in there. See, this is what happens. If we don't heed Paul's warnings, we run the risk of putting ourselves or other people, resigning them to a place of pain and perilous, can't walkedness. Which is not abundant lifedness. See what I mean? See, it's about time that we recognize how much God loves us. That he loves us so much. That we would elevate our spirituality above our own inability to really understand all things. To a place of freedom and hope in Jesus. To a place where we really could not worry about what we have that's holding us back, to what we could really stand before him and say, here I am, God. I'm all yours for all time, every day, all day. Tell me where to go, what to do, what to say, and I'll do it, and I'll celebrate it. He's given us the opportunity for life abundant. An abundant life is one that is actually not just accepting God's love, but it's also sharing God's love and ultimately celebrating the reality of God's love. What if we realize that that's what our lives were destined and meant for? And what if even in living that way, it brought hope to the people around us? Not just generic hope, but personal, I've been there hope. I suggest that what Paul wanted, which is what God wanted, for his people, not to be held back by each other, but to be free to really live through him.